Let's build a Data Studio community visualization, part 6. Today, we talk about the most complex feature in my visualization. We will not continue with the code we wrote in the last 5 videos. Instead, we look into my code of the real custom table. But I used the same names for most of the variables, so I hope you can follow. I'm not writing the code again for this video since it would take way too long. So what is the feature I'm going to show you today? I want the user to be able to do changes and stylings for different columns, and most important, to select any combination of columns the user wants to see. That means, for example, if the user wants to set the source medium column of this table right at the end of the table, he should be allowed to do this. He should also be able to set which comparison columns he wants to see for each metric. So if he wants to see the relative change for sessions, he should be able to do this. And if he wants to see the absolute change for users, he should be able to do this as well. In the regular tables in Data Studio, you can easily select if you want to see absolute or relative changes for a metric. In a community visualization, this is not possible because right now Data Studio does not give you any style elements for every dimension and metric you add. You can do global settings, but changing something for a specific column requires a method that I had to create first. This is a version of my table which is only a few steps ahead of what we created in the first 5 videos. I did some styling, like scrolling inside of the table if the data is too much, which actually took a lot of time. And most important, I changed the comparison. So now you can select which comparison metric you want to see. By default, it's the comparison values, but we can also set it to relative change and absolute change. And I want to show you quickly how I did this. Let's look at the console and check the array, which is the DEF array we already worked with. Inside of each row, we have the dimension and the metric and the comparison metric. We already know these from the last videos, as well as the display dimension, the display metric, and the display comparison metric. We already know these as well. The new variables are the comp metric abs and comp metric rel, which is for comparison metric absolute and comparison metric relative, as well as the display versions of these 2 variables. We take a quick look how I created this. Remember our DEF for each loop, which we used to format every row and every value? Besides some converting from null to null action, which I'm not going to explain in this video, you also see the comparison metric rel and ABS here, which is first created as an empty array, and then we put some values inside. So this code here says if we have the comparison and if our comparison metric exists and if our metric exists, then we just fill them as we would expect. The absolute change should be our metric minus the comparison metric. And the display version should be the same, metric minus comparison metric, and our relative should be the metric minus the comparison metric divided by our comparison metric. If we do not have our metric, just the comparison metric, it means that we have some lost data. I actually included an SQL join for this lost data in the final version. So we want to set our comparison absolute to null minus the comparison metric because we lost all these data. And the comparison metric rel, we're going to set to null minus comparison metric divided by comparison metric. This could be also like null minus 1, but let's leave it. I don't know why I did it like this. And for the display version, the same. If we do not have a comparison metric, but we have a metric. We just want to set this. So it means the data is new and there is nothing to compare with. So the absolute comparison is just the metric. We have all the positive development, and the relative comparison should be null here. I think in the final version of the table, I set it to infinity in this case. In the formatting section, I only formatted the comparison absolute as duration, if it is a duration, and the comparison relative as a percentage, because it's always a percentage. If it is a number or a currency, I did the same thing with number or currency for absolute changes and percentages for relative changes. I scroll down a little to where I built the table. So in here, for the cells comparison, you will see it looks a little more complicated when I add all the values. We see here the comp metric dict, which is a dictionary for the comparison metric, and the comparison select, which is the field the user can select. I'm quickly going to show you what is behind these variables. First, the comparison metric dict. And this is basically just a dictionary that translates the input the user is giving us, like value, relative, or absolute, which is the ID behind the field. And the comp metric rel, and comp metric apps, these are the names the variables have in our DEF variable. And the comparison select is just the visData style comp metric value. So this is the value of the field we created, which is either value, relative, or absolute. So I scroll down back to where we built the table. And you see with these two variables, the comp metric dict and the comparison select, we are able to query very dynamically which comparison metric we want to see in the table. I added a regular table to show you the difference between community visualization and these regular tables. So in here, we can change the width of a column simply by drag and drop. I cannot think of any solution how we can do this with a community visualization, but we should be able to change the width of a column. But we also have some settings. So in the style panel, we have some settings for the dimensions. There's column 1 and column 2, and we can change the text align to center or to right. And if I would add another dimension, there would be another field here where we can select the text align of column 3. And the same thing we have for the metrics. We have column number 1, which we can choose to be a number, a heat map, or a bar chart. And we can even select if the number should be there or not, if it should be centered or left or right. And you see the comparison does behave the same way as the metric. I don't like this that much. I think the comparisons should be handled separately. But you have these options. You can select if you want compact numbers and the decimal precision. Maybe let's change it to something else. Yes. And you even have some options for this bar chart. So you can show the target, and let's select a target of 10,000 to see what it does. Okay, so it sets a line at some point. So you have even some options there. So these are pretty decent options. And most important, for every metric you can select if you want to see the comparison value and if you want to see the comparison value as absolute or relative. While I think these are pretty good options you have, I still don't like one thing about it. And this is that it is based on the number of the column and not on the metric. So if I move our sessions, because I may want that it's the second metric and not the first anymore, we see all of our stylings and options for users instead now. So if we want to change it back to sessions, we would have to do all the settings again, and we would have to unset for the first column. And this is something I hate when I work with large tables inside Data Studio. So when I created a method where we define some settings for different metrics, I want it to be based on metric names and not on the column order. I created a diagram to illustrate my idea. So the simplest idea would be that the user gives an input which columns he wants to see, and our visualization just displays the columns he set. And if he does not set any input, we should have some system where we define some default columns instead. I quickly noticed that we cannot use the actual column names because there might be duplicates in there. All of our comparison columns are delta right now, and I would not want if the user has to decide between delta 1 and delta 2 for like delta of the sessions or delta comparison absolute or something. We have to create a naming convention for the different fields, and we have to inform the user somehow how these fields are named. So I thought we have to extend this chart to the left, and we start with converting the field names to a new naming convention where every field name is very recognizable but also unique. And out of this naming convention, we build up something like a configuration mode where the user can look up all the different column names and decides which columns he wants to have. So the user activates this configuration mode to know all the column mode and do the configuration, and then he deactivates it and gives the input which columns he wants to see. And on the other hand, on the right side of this chart, we need to do also a little bit more. Let's go more into the technical solution here. So out of the input the user is giving us, we should create something like a dictionary to map the input to our DEF variable to get the right data. And then we need to change our HTML table build based on this new dictionary, and then our custom table will display the columns that we want. Before we look at the code, let me show you how it works in the end. I uploaded a new version where we already did everything we just talked about. And now we have some options under Advanced Configuration. And there's a checkmark for Show Config Mode, which we check. And then we see all the available fields with the names. We have source medium, device category, the sessions and users, and then we have our comparison metrics. Sessions underscore compvel, comp apps, and comprel. If we want to select which columns we want to have, we can copy the default fields, paste them here, and then we may delete one field like this session comp apps. We can delete this, and you see it gets removed from the table. And instead we may want the session compvel here, right behind these sessions. And this gets added. And we even can do another order, like put the device category at first out of the table. You see it does not change the amount of rows in the table, but only it will change the columns, so these get removed. And we put it back here. We have an error right now because we end with a comma. And this error handling is something we need to add in a later version. And I added something that tells you where the error might be and what the input actually should look like. So this is the result we want to achieve. And now we start with the naming conventions we have here. So my naming conventions go like this. At first, I'll take the field names from every dimension and metric, like source medium or device category, and remove everything that is not a letter or a number and lowercase this. You see it when I activate the consent mode again, that source medium is basically the same as source medium, but to lowercase and without any special characters. And the same thing with device category. For any comparison values, I add this underscore comparison val, the comp val. I add the comp abs for comparison absolute and the comp val for the comparison relative. There are a few edge cases that apply here. For example, what if two fields have the same name? Let me add sessions here again, like this. And I decided that the second sessions metric should be just named to sessions2. So the ID would be sessions2 underscore and then the comparison, or just sessions2. And the same thing happens when I add another source medium combination. So it's just source medium 2. So this is the first edge case. The second edge case is, what if after we remove all the non-letter or non-number characters, what if there's nothing there anymore? What if a name consists only of special characters? So let me do this. Let me name this to just underscore. And then I decided that I just rename it to dimension or to metric. And if there's more of them, I go with dimension 2 or metric 2. So this is the naming convention that I decided to do. Let me redo this back to default. Change it back, everything. And now I want to check the console to show you the dictionary that is behind this. First, we may deactivate the config mode, and then we check the console. And there are a lot of entries in here, so we may want to reload. So we have only one entry. So there we go. And I put a name above each console log to see which variable is logged right now. So at first we have our vis data, and then we have the DEF variable with all the different variables like display dimension and so on. And now we have some other variables we have to talk about right now. And the variable that I created for the naming convention is this dimsmats variable, which looks like this. So for every field in the chart, like device category, sessions, source medium, and users, we have some entry with concept, ID, ID key, name and number and type. So most of these values are the same as you see in the fields variable here. So you see the ID, name, type and concept. But the new things are the number and the ID key. I created this ID key to match the user inputs. So if the user decides that he wants to have the device category column, it should match the device category inside this dimsmats variable, and you can check the number to know where exactly to find this. So it is for the concept dimension the number one variable. So inside our DEF, we can check the dimension, and the dimension with the number one is desktop. So this is the device category. And let's check another one. Let's check the users, or maybe the sessions. This has a number 0. It is a metric, concept metric, number 0. Let's check it here. So inside the metrics, it's the number 0. We have sessions. Yeah, we just checked sessions, so we have sessions. We take a look at the code now to see how I created this. And you will find it very similar to what we created in the last videos. It's right after we do the formatting, like month, day, day of week, and hyperlink. I didn't do image here yet, but I created this later in my first version. But right after we created all this DEF variable, we now go to the dims_mats, which is an empty array at first. And then we have some ADV usage. This is a field we can set, and I can show you what I try to do. So let me change this to, it is in the advanced section, and let me change it to field IDs. And you see kind of nothing happens, but if we go to config mode, you see that the field IDs are there as our names. So I thought maybe it is a good idea to have, instead of the field names, the field IDs. So I included this from the start, but I don't know. I think it is not a very helpful idea. I use field names all the time. So we just assume that this is the field naming variable. Then I created a deep copy of our visData fields. I don't think that I had to do this since I'm not changing anything, but I thought maybe I have to change something, but it does not look like I'm doing it. So I think maybe I did not need this all fields variable. I could work with visData fields instead and I would be good, but I did it. Okay. And then we do for every dimension the following. So we take out the field name and do a replace function that replaces everything that is not a letter or a number with nothing, and do the toLowercase function. So this is the transformation I was talking about. And here we have the condition. If there's nothing left anymore, we just name it to dimension. Next thing would be, if we have a dimension name twice, we would do a little for loop where we define a variable check should equal to, and we do this maximum of 21s. And we put this check variable to our dimension names if we do not have these in the dims_mats. So if we have a device category 2 already, we might go to device category 3 and so on until the name is unique again. And when we do this, we also set the number where to find this dimension, and also the ID key, which is the dimensions key plus our check variable. For all the non-duplicate dimensions, we just set the numbers and the ID key, and everything else we take from the all fields variable. And we do the same thing with the metrics again. There really is nothing different with the metrics, it's just the same thing. So this is how we get our dims_mats variable. Let's look at it again. Check the console and look at our dims_mats variable. So we have device category with all of our field variables from the visData, and additionally our number, where to find it, and our ID key, which is the same thing as the key of that variable, and the input the user should type. I added the config mode to our code somewhere after I created the table. You find a config mode variable that is the value of the visdata style adv config mode, which is this check mark you just saw. If this is true, then do the following, and then we just create some HTML code around our table to give some information. We add a class to our top row, and then we create some HTML code, a div, an h3 element, which contains the available fields headline. And we have a variable where we define the endings to our fields. So we have nothing, then we have the comparison value, absolute and relative, which is the same as you see here. You have the first and the second column with no ending, and then you have the same thing with the underscore and then the comparison ending. And then we do a loop where we do either 2 runs or 5 runs, depending on if we have the comparison, which is this n variable here that has a condition. If we have the comparison, then set it to 5. If not, then set it to 2. And then we go 2 times or 5 times through this loop where we create a div and a span and a URL, which is a list, and some list items for every metric and dimension we have. In the first version, this was everything that the config mode could do. It just sets all the available fields and the default fields. In the final version, it could do a little more. You have this config mode headline, which is easy to do. And in the table, you will not see the values anymore. You will see some CSS classes you can use for stylings that each cell has. And I think this is pretty helpful. You will even find an explanation which CSS class means what, and some other helpful information. We talked about everything that is on the left side of this diagram. We converted the field names to a new naming convention, and we built up a config mode where the user can look up everything he needs to know. Now I want to show you how the user is giving us the input, and if he does not, how the default columns are created. As you saw in my little showcase, the input is like a text with fields that are comma separated. Therefore, the column input variable is just the visdata style adv columns field and the value of this field. I tested a little bit with these example input, so you get an idea of what the input should look like. I'm not very proud of how I created this default input, because you will see a lot of plus and comma and plus here. So I put the string together element by element with some helping array, and it's not very elegant. I guess you should come to a better solution than me when you create this. So let's go right over to what I'm doing with the column input later. And I want you to show the final variable in Data Studio first. We are back in Data Studio, and we see our column input as an array. So I split that up and separate it by comma. We combine the column input with our dims maths naming convention to get the final calls variable. In here, you find everything you need to build up the table. You will see the different columns that this table should have and where to find these. So for example, the fourth column so that's the fourth element with the number 3 here. This is a comparison column, you will find the display variable in the display comp metric absolute and in the first spot because it's number 0. And you will find the exact metric in the comp metric apps. So even without reading this name here, sessions comp apps, I would know where to find this in our diff variable. Let's search it. So this comp metric apps is in the variable comp metric apps. Let's check this. You will find it here and it's the first spot. So this is the absolute change of our sessions. And the same thing with our display comp metric absolute. We also have the first spot in here. So this array tells us everything we need and we can build up the table. Let's see how we build up this variable. At first we define an empty array as final calls. And the idea is that for each of our column inputs, we create a new final column and push this to our final calls. You will see it down here. And this final call has these variables and we have to find these variables in the code. We will find the name in our dims/mats naming convention with splitting it up by underscore and taking everything before the underscore. So if it is a comparison metric, we will see the actual name of the metric. We can use this name then to get the number, where to find it in the array. Then we can check if it is a comparison metric. So if anything is behind the underscore, we assume that it is a comparison metric. Then we take the concept as comparison and we make the name as delta. If it's not a comparison, we take the name right of our dims/mats naming conventions with the name we just found. And the same thing we do with the concept. Then we check if the concept is a dimension. If it is a dimension, our final variable should be dimension. This is the name of the def variable, which also has the display variable, so we know where exactly in the def data we can find this. Same thing we do with the metric. And if the concept is a comparison, it gets a little more complicated. We need to find out first if the suffix is the comparison value, then we would need the comp metric and the display comp metric. If it is a comp rel, we would need the comp metric rel and the display comp metric rel, and the same thing with the absolute change. So then we build up our final call and push it to our final columns. Remember how we built our table in the last video? We ended up with this code. We needed some for loops for all our metrics, for all our dimensions. We had to check if we have a comparison, then we need to create some other cells. And for the body, the same thing. We had to go through all of our dimensions, through all of our metrics, and do the comparison stuff here as well. Now look at the code we have now. This is everything we need to build the table with our new method. It's much more reduced. This is because we do not have to distinguish anymore between metrics, comparisons, or dimensions. We have our final calls array and everything we need is in there. So we just have to distinguish between the header and the body cells. We can set the header only with our final calls. So for each th, we need the inner text with the final calls name, which is like the name of this final calls here, like source medium. And then we set some attributes like the concept to lowercase or the key of that column. In the final version, we are doing much more, but this is it. And for the body, We also loop through our def variable, and we loop through our final calls variable here as well. We also create our TD element, and then we add some classes. We add the final calls concept to this as well as the key. And the inner HTML does look a little more complicated because these are like 5 variables in one. So we have to call the def variable in the J line, which is like every line in the data. And with the final calls display var, in combination with the final calls number, we will get to the right data. And the same thing happens with the data value attribute, where we put the actual values with the final calls var and the final calls number. That's it for today's video. I hope I explained it well enough for you to follow. As a non-programmer, this method took me quite some time to work out, but I liked the result. And I also used it to create features to change column names, to do conditional formatting, and with some CSS tricks to create bar charts and heat maps. Next time, we will try to add some cross-filtering interactions to our table. See you then.